Maxwell looked down at the polished brass doorknob, staring back at his own distorted reflection. He had stopped uneasily on the very last worn step before entering Havisham House, an old Victorian home that looked so out of place within its modern suburban surroundings you'd think it had been intentionally built to stand out like a sore thumb. From the reports Maxwell had heard and the file that his boss carelessly tossed onto his desk, that had a note affixed to the front of, or maybe the back, it's often hard to tell, that said, "Check this out, kid, seems to be your sort of thing." Your sort of thing was the occult. Maxwell had gained a love for such things through exposure to many a late-night horror show as a child, and his deepening obsession with the paranormal and supernatural through his adolescence. However, by the time he was an adult, or at least considered one by law, Maxwell had learnt to rein those thoughts in. But he couldn't help but get a giddy feeling every time he saw evidence of the supernatural, something he saw everywhere. And now here he was, standing outside the door of a house that everyone seemed to truly believe was haunted. Every neighbour he had spoken to spoke of odd lights that came from deep inside, of odd shapes that appeared at the windows, and oddly enough that the trees that surrounded the old building had never lost their leaves. Of course, Maxwell realised that this last one was due to the trees being evergreens, and thus couldn't help but wonder if superstition had replaced common sense with some of these people. However, had Maxwell been paying attention to a small child who attempted to speak up while Maxwell was talking to the child's parents, he may have learnt something very valuable. But no one listens to kids, despite what they might see during the dark hours of the night or what they might have heard during their most fearful nightmares. So it was without that valuable information that Maxwell now stood on Havisham House's front porch, that his hand slowly reached for the polished brass doorknob and failed to notice the child watching from a window across the way, silently pleading for the nice man whom he had only just met to not go inside. But oblivious to those silent warnings, as we all often are, Maxwell, poor unlucky Maxwell, grasped the doorknob, feeling the cool metal against his slightly sweaty palm. A smarter man may have noticed the unusually cool metal during such an otherwise hot day, especially when on his first approach Maxwell was briefly blinded by a rogue ray of light reflecting off the doorknob, bathing it in a hypocritical holy glow. But of course, Maxwell was not a smart man. A smart man would have taken all those horror stories and learnt what not to do. The first and foremost being not to enter a haunted house, both uninvited and alone. Though Maxwell wasn't alone, not truly. The child was still watching. Through his fingers, the child was still watching. He didn't need to, however. He'd seen it happen time and time again. From that brave boy with the last name of Miller who stepped inside for a moment and was swallowed up by shadows, the child's own dog who, in the hunt for a squirrel that had invaded the dog's land, ran inside the building after the intruder with neither animal being seen again. An unfortunate event indeed for the squirrel, who was actually just coming to ask a question on the uniformity of string theory. Out of the two options it was soon presented with, it's assumed that being mauled by a dog may have been the lesser of two evils. Maxwell turned the knob, which responded with a quick click. The door was never locked, or at least not for long. Apparently various groups had tried to keep it locked. The police, the city council, Girl Scout Troop number 319, after one of their own was lost to it, but to no avail. The next day it would always be unlocked, sometimes even the next hour. And even once, to one cop who tried his damnedest, the very next second. The sound becoming like a middle finger raised proudly by the house itself. Though houses of course do not have fingers, except for the great clapping witch hut of Papua New Guinea, which every stroke of the 13th hour claps a thunderous applause, and then falls silent. Other attempts have been made through the years to remove the house entirely, though it was made difficult due to anyone spouting the phrase, "the house ain't my relation," was seen as absolutely mad. Fires had been started inside and out in hopes of taking out the house once and for all, but it never worked. The first attempt burnt the house to the ground, but less than a day later it had rebuilt itself. The next 5 attempts were all stopped by the fact the house had installed a sprinkler system, or at least a kind of system. Really, it just burst a pipe inside itself and waited for the fire to go out. After a while, people just stopped trying. Those who were foolish enough to go in were written off as missing by parents who had tried their best to warn their children, and some adults even used it to their gain. But the house soon caught on to this and ceased activity until the man who kept coming decided to step inside to see for himself and was duly swallowed whole. Maxwell, finally, after many moments of gathering his courage, opened the door, failing to notice the subtle shift underfoot, the boards beneath him subtly raising to force his step inside. As he did, nothing happened. Not because there was nothing to happen, as there was more than plenty, but just simply because. The house, like anyone of weak will, had gotten into the habit of satiating its urges post-haste. But after a heavy Halloween, where it had swallowed up 4 variants of superheroes and a person in a costume best left unmentioned, the house had decided to hold itself in check. Even more so was when Maxwell crossed the threshold, he shut the door behind him. A kind gesture to an empty and missing household. The child across the street watched in horror, but knew what had happened. He heard the door click, a soft, terrible noise that reached out to him, a noise he would hear in his dreams. Inside Havisham House, Maxwell found it to be quite hospitable, as anyone would as long as they were idiots oblivious to the fate about to befall them. Inside the house, everything was neat and tidy, without even a mote of dust adorning some errant corner. This was due to the fact that the house, like any good homeowner, kept itself clean, at one point even hiring a maid service to come in and reach some of the spots the house just couldn't on its own. Of course, this ended with the maid being swallowed whole, as the night before the house had been kept up by a street party, and thus failed to realise who had entered through its front door. Maxwell half crept about the interior, being careful with every step, a fearful glance over his shoulder every couple of seconds adding to his growing list of cowardice. If he pees, he'll be in so much trouble, the house thought. Though of course, this was redundant as Maxwell was already in trouble. So many levels of trouble that a cheap pair of urine-stained slacks would truly be the least of his problems, and in a few cases, might even help. Maxwell continued his inspection of the house for some time, using various supernatural hunting devices that he had purchased, all of which were fake and about the equivalent of ordering X-ray specs from the back of a comic. The house found this funny, so continued to watch Maxwell, getting him to go into one room after another just so that it could watch him act like some kind of scrawny Van Helsing, which reminded the house that Dracula starring Bela Lugosi was on tonight, and it didn't really want to have to deal with Maxwell and the mess he would cause. Subtly, here meaning tilting so forcefully that a pipe burst in the basement, the house tried to force Maxwell out, making him stumble and fall face first into the floorboards, bruising nothing but his ego, had anyone been there to witness it. However, as we've stated, Maxwell wasn't a smart man, as no smart man would dust himself off and look at a door he had not spotted before. A smart man would not open said door despite the resistance being put up by what literally was the house itself. And finally, and most importantly, if behind that door is a rickety staircase leading into pitch black, then a smart man would certainly not descend it as he heard an odd noise. Livid, that's what the house was. Infuriated. Frustrated. Had it hands, the house would have slapped one against its own forehead, as it had often seen people do. In the 70 years since the house had first swallowed up its original owner, after a blood and magic ritual went horribly wrong and caused a stain on the carpet in the living room which had taken years to get out, the house could not believe this sequence of events. Even that squirrel that was chased in by the dog last year had the good sense to leave the house as soon as it could. The dog had not quite been as lucky, as it had stopped to relieve itself and fallen foul to the house's occupants. Oh yes, like any good home, this house had a family living inside it. One that the house had tried its best to keep quiet and out of sight. Mostly because it didn't like sharing its space with them, but also because they were rude and obnoxious. A multitude of realtors had attempted to sell the house, but for every new family inside its walls, the house had driven them away with various combinations of ghoulish tricks and ghastly measures, including setting every alarm clock to Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. And luckily each family had left before they found out about the other family, hidden in the basement. Because the other family, as Maxwell was now learning, whilst he was pressed up against the wall and looking for any chance to escape, was a family in only the basest sense of the word. Like how some people, and fairly mad ones at that, will refer to their dogs as babies. This family was a family in name only, as each and every one, from what Maxwell could tell, was a 6 foot tall, bulky, exoskeleton-plated cockroach. The 3 cockroaches that surrounded Maxwell stared down at him, turning briefly to chitter at one another. Maxwell wanted to barge past and flee, but behind them stood at least another 3, one cradling a much smaller cockroach in its arms, something it had picked up from a late-night showing of Rosemary's Baby. Maxwell's fear and rationalization at this point were fighting a battle inside his mind, as he looked at the roaches and mumbled something along the lines of, "Not possible. Must be dreaming." During Maxwell's fevered mumblings, the roaches had stopped chittering and were looking directly at him, or as best they could. In mere seconds, the roaches descended upon Maxwell, tearing him limb from limb, happily feasting on the warm meal that had been provided for them. Whilst the house, annoyed at the sheer stupidity of Maxwell, simply settled and waited for the night to descend, the movie to come on, and for the next poor unlucky fool to step inside.